Welcome back to Old Charles today. We are taking a close look at a coin that just about every single American has held in their hand at one point or another. It's the humble nickel of the United States 5-cent piece. But the one we're talking about today is a very specific year, 1983 now. If you were just starting out in coin collecting, or if you found a whole bunch of these in an old jar, you might be wondering, is my 1983 nickel worth anything? Is it just 5 cents, or could it be something more? Well, stick around because we're going to dive deep into everything about the 1983 nickel, its varieties, its potential value, and what you need to be looking for on your own coins. Let's get started first. Let's talk about the basics. The nickel you're used to seeing has been around in a very similar form for a very long time, since 1938. In fact, it features a portrait of Thomas Jefferson on the obverse, the front of the coin, and his home Monticello on the reverse, the back. This design is often called the Jefferson Nickel, and it ran all the way from 1938 until 2003 when they introduced the Westward Journey Series. So what about the 1983 nickel? Well, in 1983, the United States Mint produced a massive number of these coins, over 800 million of them, just from the Philadelphia and Denver mints combined. That is a lot of nickels. So right away, that tells you something. Most 1983 nickels are extremely common and are worth just their face value of 5 cents if you find one in your pocket change. That is almost certainly what you have, and this is a very important, but there are specific varieties and errors that were produced in 1983 that can make certain examples of this coin very valuable to collectors. So how do you tell the difference? Let's break it down. First, you need to know where your coin was made. Look at the reverse of the coin, the side with Monticello on it above the building on the right side. You will see a small letter that is the mint mark. If there is no mint mark, that means it was made at the Philadelphia Mint. If there is 8D, it was made at the Denver Mint in 1983. There were no proof coins made for collectors, so all the coins you find will be business strikes from these two mints. Now, the Philadelphia Mint produced about 561 million nickels in 1983, and the Denver Mint produced about 536 million nickels. Again, these are huge numbers, so a standard 1983p nickel or a 1983D nickel in circulated condition is worth 5 cents. But now we get to the exciting part, the errors. The 1983 nickel is famous in the error coin world for one particular and very dramatic mistake: the repunched mint mark, or RPM, and the double die varieties. These are the coins that could be worth some real money. Let's start with the repunched mint mark. This happens when the mint mark is punched into the coin die by hand, and it is punched more than once and not perfectly aligned. This creates a doubling or even tripling effect on the mint mark itself. So for a 1983 nickel, you need to take a very close look at that D mint mark on your Denver minted coins. Get a magnifying glass or a loupe if you can, and really examine that letter D. You are looking for signs of a secondary or even a tertiary image, a shadow, or a slight doubling around the edges of it. There are several known and catalog varieties for the 1983 DRPM. For example, there is the 1983 DRPM1, which shows a very distinct secondary south-southeast doubling on the D. This coin, in uncirculated condition, can be worth over $100. There is also the 1983 DRPM2, which is a different pattern of doubling. It can also be quite valuable. Next, we have the double die obverse, or DDO. This is an error that occurs during the creation of the coin die itself. The die ends up with a doubled image, and when it strikes the coins, every coin from that die shows doubling on the front of the coin. On the Jefferson portrait for a 1983 nickel, you would be looking for doubling on the words "I in God we trust," or on the date, or on Jefferson's eye and hair details. This is a much rarer error to find, but it is extremely sought after. A strong double die obverse on a 1983 nickel could be worth several $100s, even more in high grade SO. How do you check for these things? You need good lighting and magnification. Look at your coin, carefully compare it to known examples. You can find pictures online or in error coin guides. Look for those telltale signs of doubling. Now, let's talk about condition. Even a common date coin can be worth a little more than face value if it is in pristine, uncirculated condition. A 1983 nickel that has never been in circulation, that still has its full luster and no scratches, or where it might be worth 25 to 50 cents to a collector who is trying to build a complete set in top condition. So if you have a roll of brand new shiny 1983 nickels, it is worth holding onto, but the real value is in those error coins. So to summarize for you, if you have a 1983 nickel, first check The mint mark is at 8P or AD, then take a much closer look if it is a D. Examine that mint mark for any signs of doubling. If you see something that looks unusual, you might have an RPM variety, then look at the obverse of the date and the inscription for any signs of a double D. If you think you have found one of these error coins, the next step is to get it certified by a professional grading service like PCGS or NGC. This authenticates the coin and gives it a grade, which will then determine its true market value. Okay, everyone, today we're going on a historical journey, a deep dive into the story of the coin. We're so familiar with the United States 5-cent piece, but to truly understand a coin like the 1983 nickel, we have to go back, way back to its very beginnings. The history is richer and more complex than you might think. So let's start at the start. The very first 5-cent coins in America were not nickels, and they were not even made of nickel. They were tiny silver coins called half dimes. These were authorized by the Coinage Act of 1792 and were made of silver. They were produced alongside the larger silver dollars and half dollars for decades. But there was a problem, a big one. In the 1850s, the Civil War was looming, and people began hoarding gold and silver coins. This caused a massive shortage of small change in everyday circulation. Commerce was suffering. People needed a way to make small purchases. This crisis created an opportunity. A man named Joseph Wharton, who controlled the only major nickel mine in the United States, saw his chance. He began lobbying Congress hard for a new coin, a new 5-cent piece, made not of silver, but of a copper and nickel alloy. This was a tough sell because nickel is an incredibly hard metal, and it was very difficult to strike coins with it. It would wear out the minting dies very quickly, but the need for coinage was so great that Congress finally listened. In 1866, they authorized a new 5-cent coin made of a composition we would not recognize today. It was 75% copper and 25% nickel. This was the birth of a nickel as we know it. But the first nickel did not have Jefferson on it. Oh no, the first design was the shield nickel. It featured a large shield on the obverse and the number 5 surrounded by stars and rays on the reverse. It was a sturdy, simple coin, and it helped solve the coinage shortage. Then in 1883, something huge happened. The mint introduced the Liberty head nickel. It featured a portrait of Lady Liberty on the front. But here is the famous error on the first versions of this coin. The word cents was missing from the reverse. It just said V, the Roman numeral for 5. Unscrupulous people realized they could plate these new nickels in gold and pass them off as $5 gold pieces. This forced the mint to quickly change the design and add the word cents below the V, a classic case of an error shaping history. A Liberty head nickel had a long run, but by 1938 there honor one of America's founding fathers on a circulating coin. To mark this, the mint held a competition, and a sculptor named Felix Schlag won. His design featured a portrait of Thomas Jefferson on the obverse and a front view of his magnificent home Monticello on the reverse. This was the birth of the Jefferson Nickel, first issued in 1938. Now the history of this coin gets really interesting. During World War II, nickel was a critical war material needed for making armor and other military equipment. So in 1942, the composition of the nickel changed for the first time. They removed the nickel metal entirely for a few years. From mid-1942 through 1945, the 5-cent piece was made of 56% copper, 35% silver, and 9% manganese. These are the famous wartime silver nickels. You can identify them by their large mint mark above the dome of Monticello on the reverse. They're the only US nickels that ever contained silver after the war. In 1946, the mint returned to the standard 75% copper, 25% nickel composition. And that is what they used for decades, all the way through the 1980s, including our 1983 coin. But the design saw some subtle changes over the years. The initial portrait of Jefferson was considered a bit too formal. So in 1966, the mint slightly modified the design to make his hair less detailed and to move the mint mark from the reverse to the obverse right next to Jefferson's bust, where it would remain for years. Then in 1971, the mint stopped using pure nickel in the plating process for the coin core. It started using a clad layer of a copper-nickel alloy bonded to a pure copper core. This made the coins cheaper to produce, but they kept the same overall appearance. So by the time we get to 1983, the Jefferson Nickel was a mature and stable design. It was a workhorse of American commerce. The mint was producing them by the hundreds of millions in Philadelphia, and Denver. The coin itself was a direct descendant of that. Original. Nickel, the same size, the same fundamental purpose, the same basic metallic composition, a direct link to over a century of American history. The 1983 nickel sits at a fascinating point in this timeline. It is a modern coin, but it is part of the original Jefferson Nickel series that ended in 2003. It was made before the Westward Journey series, before the return of Monticello, and before the new shield. Reverse in the 2010s, it is a classic example of a coin that everyone used and few people thought about, which is exactly why finding one of its famous errors like the